tanker truck backed down the lane at Esh Farm the way it had every Tuesday for 11 years, its rear valve already sweating a thin white ribbon of sour milk onto the gravel before the driver had it lined up with the drainage ditch that ran along the fence row. The ditch had a smell to it that did not wash out of the air even in winter, sour and close, the smell of milk that had gone past what anybody wanted to drink and was being asked to become nothing instead, poured into the ground and left to soak away into 5 acres that had not grown anything worth cutting in longer than most people in the township could remember. They called it the sour lot. Not unkindly, particularly, just the plain word for a plain fact, the way you would call a field the rock lot or the low 40, except this name came with a curl of the lip attached to it. Because everybody understood that letting a creamery dump its leftover milk onto your own ground for 11 years was not farming. It was giving up on farming and taking a small check for the privilege. Levi Esch stood at the gate that morning, with his hand raised before the driver had the hose uncoiled, and he did not raise it in greeting. Whit Grissom cut the engine and leaned out the window and said, "Same as always, Levi." And Levi said, "Not today, Whit. Put it in the tank instead." He had built the tank himself over the winter, a squat concrete cistern with a pump line running from it toward the hog lot he had not yet stocked, and when Whit Grissom climbed down to look at it, he scratched the back of his neck and said it was a fair piece of work for something that was just going to smell the same either way. That was when Harlan Voss's truck slowed on the township road, because Harlan Voss's truck slowed for most things worth slowing for, and he rolled his window down and took in the tank, and the hose, and Levi standing there in his hat and suspenders with his sleeves already rolled for a day of building, and he said, loud enough for Whit Grissom and for the 2 Zimmerman boys walking the fence line with fishing poles to hear it clean, "You're going to feed hogs on spoiled milk, Esh? That's a good way to kill 6 pigs and call it a lesson." There was a beat where the ditch dripped, and nobody filled it. Levi did not raise his voice and did not lower it either. He said, "We'll see how they do, Harlan," and then he turned back to the hose and showed Whit Grissom where the coupling needed to go, and that was the whole of his answer, delivered once, not repeated. What Harlan Voss did not know, because he had never had reason to walk the fence line of another man's ruined field, was that 6 weeks earlier, Levi had knelt at the edge of that sour lot with a trowel and turned up a patch of clover, thicker and greener than anything growing in his good pasture 40 yards away. Clover that should not have been there at all on ground everyone agreed was poisoned, and he had sat on his heels for a long while looking at it before he said anything to anyone. He did not mention it to Harlan Voss that morning. He did not mention it to Whit Grissom either. He let the truck fill the tank instead of the ditch, watched the level rise pale and cloudy in the concrete, and when it was done he thanked the driver, latched the gate, and walked back up toward the barn without once looking to see whether Harlan Voss was still parked on the road shaking his head. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Cedar County had never had much use for the Esch place beyond what it had always had use for, which was a fair stand of corn, a small dairy herd sold off 2 generations back, and a family that kept to itself in the way that suited both the family and the county fine. Levi Esch was 37 years old that spring, a wide, quiet man who moved like someone who had done a great deal of physical work and expected to keep doing it, and he had been alone on the farm, in the particular sense that mattered, for 2 years, since his wife Miriam had died of complications after their daughter Ruth was born, a fact the community knew and respected enough not to speak of directly, the kind of thing that got referred to as the hard year and nothing more. He raised Ruth, who was 4 now, and his son Daniel, who was 7, with the help of Fanny Stoltzfus, a widow from 2 farms over whose husband had gone down with his heart in a hayfield the autumn before Miriam passed, and who needed the work as much as Levi needed the hands, though neither of them ever put it in those terms out loud. The farm itself had come to Levi 4 years earlier, when his father, Reuben Esch, died of a stroke behind the plow lines on a Thursday in October, quick and without much warning, The kind of death the community called a mercy. In the same breath, they called it a shame. Reuben had run 300 acres of corn, oats, and hay, competently and without ambition beyond competence, and he had kept the arrangement with Dremore Creamery going because his own father, Amos Esch, had started it decades before during a stretch when milk prices had collapsed and the creamery needed somewhere legal and cheap to put its surplus rather than pay to haul it to a treatment plant 2 counties over. It was, in the plain accounting of it, a small favor exchanged for a small quarterly check, and by the time it reached Levi it had calcified into a habit nobody examined anymore. The sour lot sitting there year after year like a bruise nobody bothered pressing on. He had never given serious thought to changing it. There was corn to put in, and oats to bring off, and 2 children who needed feeding, and a widow's grief to make room for alongside his own. And a 5-acre patch of used-up ground was not, by any reasonable measure, the most pressing thing on 300 acres. What changed it was not a plan. It was a box. The box had sat in the corner of the harness room since Reuben's funeral, a wooden crate of ledgers and seed catalogs and folded auction bills that Levi had moved twice without opening, the way a man moves a thing he is not ready to look at, because looking at it means admitting the person who filled it is not coming back to explain any of it himself. He opened it on a February evening the winter, before the tanker truck stopped at the tank instead of the ditch, not for any particular reason he could name afterward, except that the house was quiet with the children asleep, and Fanny gone home, and the wind doing the kind of steady work outside that made a man want something to do with his hands that was not chores. He found his father's ledgers first. Years of them, corn yields and hog prices, and the cost of shoeing horses recorded in Reuben's small, careful hand, and beneath those, older, softer at the corners, 3 ledgers belonging to his grandfather Amos. The earliest of them dated in the winter of 1937. Amos Esch had farmed through years that did not forgive mistakes, and his ledger read like a man keeping score against a hard opponent. Weights and prices and losses recorded without complaint, and without hope of complaint changing anything. Levi read by lamplight the way his grandfather had written by it, and it was well past midnight when he came to an entry from the spring of 1938 that he would read again a dozen times over the following 2 years, an entry that said, plainly, in ink, gone the color of weak tea, no market for the milk again, this week. Poured half of it out before I thought better, and gave the rest to the hogs instead. They took to it quick, better than the mash alone. Nothing is waste, only things without their next job yet. He sat with that sentence longer than the lamp oil strictly justified. It was not, on its face, a remarkable thing to write. His grandfather had not meant it as a philosophy, only as an observation a tired man made about surplus milk and hungry pigs on a night not unlike this one. But Levi turned it over the way he turned over most things, without making more of it than it was at first, and then a little more the second time, and a little more again the third, until by the 4th reading it had stopped being a note about hogs, and started being a note about the sour lot, sitting 5 acres wide at the edge of his own farm, soaking up milk that was, by his grandfather's own hand, not spoiled so much as unclaimed. He kept reading. Later entries from the same year, and the next confirmed it was not a single desperate improvisation, but a working method. One Amos Esch had kept up for the better part of a decade before the dairy herd was sold off, and the practice quietly lapsed. An entry from the autumn of 1941 noting hogs sold at market weight nearly a month earlier than the neighboring Kessler place, with a line beneath it that read, "Milk-fed hogs finish faster, and the meat comes out sweeter. Ray Kessler himself said so at the sale barn," though he would not say why. Levi read that line, and thought of the clover he had found at the edge of the sour lot the previous autumn, thick and green where nothing should have grown, and something in him that had been idle since Miriam died, some part of his attention that had gone slack with grief, and then with the plain grinding work of raising 2 children alone, came back into focus with a kind of quiet, unhurried certainty. He did not tell anyone that night. He closed the ledger, set it back in the box, and sat a while longer in the dark before he went up to bed, which was, for a man who rarely let himself sit still. Its own kind of statement, though he was the only one there to read it. He spent the better part of 2 years after that, off and on between seasons, reading everything he could find on the subject, without ever letting on to a soul what he was reading toward. He wrote a letter to the extension office in the county seat, and got back a photocopied bulletin on dairy byproduct feeding that used words like whey solids and biological oxygen demand. Words he had to work through slowly at the kitchen table after the children were down, translating each one into something he could picture. And what he pictured, eventually, was simple enough that he wondered why it had taken him 2 winters of reading to arrive at it. Sour milk was not spoiled milk in the sense that mattered to a hog. It had gone past the point a person wanted to drink it, but the sugars and the proteins in it had not vanished. They had only changed form, soured by bacteria that made the milk more acidic. And that acid, the bulletin explained, did something useful in an animal's gut, discouraging the kind of harmful bacteria that caused scours and other trouble in young stock. The same reason a person might eat yogurt for the same benefit, though nobody at the extension office put it in those terms. Old-timers, the bulletin noted almost as an aside, had fed surplus and soured milk to hogs for generations before refrigeration and modern feed formulation made it easier to buy a bag of mash than manage a byproduct stream, and the practice had simply fallen out of use, not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being necessary in a world that had other options. Levi read that line more than once. It was, in its dry, bureaucratic way, the same sentence his grandfather had written in ink, gone the color of weak tea 50 years earlier. Nothing is waste, only things without their next job yet. The sour lot was not 5 acres ruined by a bad habit. It was 5 acres of ground doing the wrong job, standing in for a hog that had never been bought. He talked to Fanny Stoltzfus about it before he talked to anyone else, mostly because she was there most evenings, and because she had a way of listening that did not rush a man toward a conclusion before he had earned it himself. He laid the ledger open on the kitchen table and read her the 1938 entry, and she read it herself afterward, tracing the line with one finger the way a person does with handwriting they are trying to hear a voice in. She said, "Your grandfather fed hogs on this." He said, "For years." She said, "And your father stopped." He said, "Sold off the dairy herd, no more milk of his own to spare, and the creamery deal was just easier, a little money instead of a little work." She was quiet a moment, and then she said, "That's not nothing, you know what you're thinking of doing." He said, "I know it." She said, "Harlan Voss is going to have opinions about it." He said, "Harlan Voss has opinions about most things." And Fanny almost smiled at that. The closest either of them came that evening to something like humor. And she said she would help however was useful, which was, from a woman managing her own grief, and 2 children not her own most days of the week, no small offer, and Levi understood it as such, even though neither of them said so directly. He began preparing that same week, quietly, in the unhurried, methodical way that was, as far as anyone in Cedar County could tell, simply how the man was built. The preparation took the better part of a winter, and did not look, to anyone driving past on the township road, like preparation for anything at all. Levi cleared the old hog lot behind the barn, unused since his father's time, and rebuilt the fencing board by board, checking each post for rot before he set it, rather than trusting the ones already standing, because a fence that failed in August with 40 hogs behind it was a problem no amount of good intentions would fix after the fact. He dug the footing for the concrete tank himself over 4 cold weeks, working an hour or 2 after chores each evening by lantern light, mixing the concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow the way his father had taught him to mix it for a spring house foundation years before, because the tank needed to hold better than 1,000 gallons without cracking, and a crack in March meant a dry trough in July. He ran a gravity feed line from the tank down to a trough system he built from salvaged stock tanks, sized so that the whey could be metered rather than dumped, mixed by hand each morning and evening with ground corn, and a portion of the regular hog ration, because straight whey alone, the extension bulletin had warned, could scour young pigs badly if it was not balanced against dry feed, and Levi had no intention of proving Harlan Voss right through carelessness. He drove to the county seat twice that winter to talk with the extension agent directly, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who ran the livestock program out of a cramped office above the feed cooperative, and who listened to his plan with the careful, non-committal patience of someone who had heard a great many farm plans in her career and learned not to promise anything until she saw numbers. She gave him a feeding schedule to start from and told him to keep records, weights especially, because records were the only thing that would tell either of them whether the idea was worth anything once the talking was done. He wrote that instruction down in a new ledger he started that January, the first page of it dated simply, and he kept that habit for the rest of the project without missing more than a handful of days across 2 years. He bought his first hogs in the second week of March, 6 wiener pigs from a scattered lot at the Millersburg sale barn that nobody else wanted to bid on. Runts and off-color pigs the auctioneer moved through quickly, because the buyers in the seats that day were there for uniform, easy finishing stock, and had no patience for anything smaller than the rest of the pen. Levi paid $11 a head for all 6, and loaded them himself, and the entry he made that night in the new ledger read, March the 3rd. 6 pigs, wiener size, 41 pounds average by the cooperative scale. Weigh twice daily, half measure with ground corn, per Whitfield's schedule, all eating well by evening. He weighed them again 2 weeks later and wrote, March the 17th, 58 pounds average. 17 pounds gained in 14 days. 1 sow ahead of the rest at 62, the others closer together. That sow, small and quick and the first to shoulder her way to the trough every single morning without fail, he named Clover, after the patch at the edge of the sour lot that had started the whole business, and naming her was the only sentimental thing he allowed himself in the entire project, a fact Fanny noticed, and did not comment on beyond a small private smile, the first time she heard him call the sow by name across the lot. Word got out inside of a month, the way word gets out in a township, where the feed store counter serves the same function as a newspaper. Ray Kessler, who ran the feed and farm supply store his family had operated for 3 generations, mentioned it first, mostly because Levi had come in for less ground corn than a hog operation his size would normally need, and when Ray asked why, Levi had told him the truth plainly, that he was cutting the ration with whey from the Creamery instead of buying it all. Ray Kessler repeated that to Delbert Snyder, a retired dairyman who still came by most mornings to sit near the stove and offer opinions on other men's farming. And Delbert repeated it, with embellishment, to Pearl Hutchins, a widow who ran the register 3 days a week and who had, by the following Saturday, heard 3 separate versions of the story, one in which Levi was feeding his hogs straight from the ditch, one in which he had lost 2 pigs already, and one in which he was doing it because he could no longer afford proper feed at all, none of which Pearl corrected before passing them along further. By the end of that month, the store had settled on a name for it, coined, depending on who told the story, either by Delbert Snyder or by Harlan Voss himself, who came in nearly every week for his own operation supplies, and who had opinions about Levi Esch that he did not keep to himself. They took to calling him Sour Milk Esch, not always to his face, but often enough that it reached him anyway, the way these things do, second-hand and third-hand, until a man simply knows what he is being called, without anyone having the nerve to say it while he is standing in the room. Harlan Voss ran 400 hogs in a modern confinement operation 2 miles down the township road. Trucks in and out most days, a formulated ration bought by the ton from a supplier in the next county, and he had built that operation from nothing over 20 years into something the county pointed to when it wanted to talk about a hog farmer doing things right. At the store one Saturday, with Delbert Snyder and 2 others listening near the stove, Harlan said, "He's feeding hogs on what a creamery couldn't sell to a dog. I give it till August before he's back buying feed like everybody else." And Delbert said, "Might be sooner than that." And Pearl, ringing up a sack of chicken scratch, said, without looking up, "Well, it is different." And nobody at the counter seemed sure whether she meant that as an insult or not, and she did not clarify. The early weeks gave the skeptics some material to work with, and Levi recorded it in his ledger with the same flat honesty he applied to everything else, because a record that only showed the good news was not a record. It was an advertisement, and he had no intention of keeping one of those. On the 29th of March, 2 of the 6 pigs scoured badly for 3 days, loose and listless, and he cut the whey ration in half and increased the dry corn until it passed, writing, March the 29th. 2 pigs scouring, likely too rich a mix too fast. Cut whey to 1/3 ration, dry feed increased. Watching closely. He lost no pigs that spring, though he came close to losing his nerve twice. Once when a sudden cold snap in early April dropped overnight temperatures into the 20s, and he sat up past midnight, checking the lot with a lantern to be sure none of the 6 had chilled. And once in late April, when Harlan Voss's truck slowed at the fence line long enough for Harlan to call out. From the window, "How's the science project coming, Esh?" Loud enough that Levi heard it clearly across 40 yards of pasture, and chose, again, not to answer it at all, which was its own kind of answer, and one that cost him something to give, though he would not have said so to anyone. By the 9th of April, the ledger recorded a different kind of news entirely. April the 9th. Weighed all 6, average now 109 pounds. Scours reported in the Zimmerman herd this week, 4 dead of it, per Ray Kessler. None here since the correction. On the 29th. Feed cost, by his own rough figuring against Ray Kessler's posted corn prices, was already running well under what a hog raised on bought mash alone would cost, though he did not trust that number yet, and wrote beside it, "Too early to say for certain. We'll keep the figure and watch it." He kept the figure, and he watched it, through May and into June, expanding the herd as the whey supply allowed, because Draymore Creamery's Tuesday delivery, once he asked Whit Grissom to keep bringing the full load rather than splitting it with the ditch, came to 400 gallons a week at the start and climbed steadily as cheese production at the plant increased through the spring. He built a second tank in May to hold the overflow, and bought 14 more wiener pigs at the Millersburg sale, again choosing from the culls and the off-color lot rather than the premium pen, because he had learned by then that the whey ration seemed to do its best work on a pig that started behind rather than ahead. May the 12th, the ledger read, "Delivery now near 1,200 gallons weekly. Second tank finished. 20 pigs total on the ration. No losses since spring. Weighed the March 6 again. Average 191 pounds. 11 weeks from weaning." That number, when he set it beside the figures Grace Whitfield had given him for typical growth rates on standard feed, sat far enough ahead of expectation that he wrote it twice, once in the body of the entry and once underlined at the bottom of the page, the closest thing to celebration his ledger allowed itself, and it was, as these things went for a man like Levi Esch, not nothing. By June, the private evidence had accumulated to the point where Levi began keeping a second column in the ledger, tracking feed cost against pounds gained the way Grace Whitfield had suggested he might if the numbers held. June the 20th, he wrote, "Figured feed cost against gain over the past month. 11 cents a pound gained, best I can reckon, once the corn and the labor are counted and the whey figured at what the creamery would otherwise pay to haul it off. Asked Ray Kessler what Voss's operation runs, and he said Harlan's told him 19 cents most months, sometimes higher when the bought feed price rises. Did not repeat this to anyone. It was, in its way, the entry that mattered most of everything he had written that spring, not because of what it proved, which was still early and unproven by his own admission, but because of the discipline it represented, the refusal to let a good number turn into a boast before it had been checked twice and checked again. He drove to the county seat the following week and asked Grace Whitfield to come out and look at the operation directly, because a man could believe his own ledger and still be wrong about what it meant, and the surest way past that particular danger, his father had taught him without ever putting it in so many words, was to ask someone who owed you nothing to check your work. Grace Whitfield arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of July, driving a county truck with a scale and a clipboard in the bed. And she walked the hog lot the way a person walks ground they intend to form an honest opinion of, slowly, looking at the fencing and the trough system and the tanks before she looked at a single pig. She was a compact, sun-weathered woman in her 50s who had spent 20 years telling farmers things they did not always want to hear, and she had a reputation in the county for being difficult to impress and harder to fool, which was precisely why Levi had asked for her rather than anyone else. She weighed a sample of the hogs herself, rather than taking his figures on faith, cross-checking them against his ledger entry by entry, and when the numbers matched, hog for hog, she looked up at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite approval either, something more careful than both. She said, "Your records are better than half the commercial operations I inspect." And Levi said, "My father kept good records. My grandfather, too." She flipped back through several weeks of entries, reading the dated figures in silence, and then she said, "This feed conversion is real. I want to run my own numbers on it properly, with your permission, and write it up for the extension bulletin, because if this holds through a full finishing cycle, it's worth other people knowing about." Levi said that was fine by him. She asked him to explain, in his own words, why he thought the way was working as well as the numbers suggested, and Levi, who had spent 2 winters translating extension bulletins into language he could picture, said it plainly. The souring is a kind of fermenting, same as it is in a crock of sauerkraut or a jar of pickled beets, and it makes the milk more acid than it started out. That acid seems to sit well with a young pig's gut, keeps down the kind of bacteria that causes the scours. Same reason a person feels better eating something soured than something spoiled outright. It isn't magic. It's just using what the milk still has left in it, instead of pouring it into the ground and calling it finished. Grace Whitfield wrote that down nearly word for word, and said, before she left that afternoon, that she would be back before the finishing weights came in, because she did not put her name on a write up until she had seen a thing through to the end. She also mentioned, almost as an aside while she was loading the scale back into her truck, that Harlan Voss's operation had called her office twice that spring, asking about a feed additive recall notice out of the State Department of Agriculture. Something to do with a mold toxin found in a batch of commercial corn feed distributed to several counties, and that the department was still tracking which suppliers and which farms had received the affected lots. Levi thanked her for the information without making much of it at the time, though he wrote it down in the ledger that evening anyway. A habit by then too deep to break even for news that did not seem, on the surface, to concern him directly. July the 3rd, the entry read, Whitfield visited, confirmed weights and feed figures, will write up for the extension bulletin if the numbers hold through finishing. Mentioned a feed recall notice affecting commercial corn rations in the region. Not using bought feed beyond what I grind myself, so likely no concern here. We'll keep watching regardless. The heat arrived in the 3rd week of July, the kind of heat Cedar County saw perhaps once in 5 summers, day after day of it, with the index climbing past 100 and staying there. The air thick and still even at night. The kind of weather that hard-pressed livestock and made the difference between an operation built with slack in it and one running at its limits. Levi's hogs, pastured with shade and mud wallows, and a diet that kept a good part of their daily intake liquid and cool from the tank, rather than dry and dusty from a feed bin, weathered it without much incident beyond the ordinary caution any farmer takes in that kind of weather. Extra water checks. Extra shade. Moving the younger stock into the barn during the worst of the afternoon, he recorded it plainly. July the 22nd. Heat index 104 for the 4th day running. All hogs eating and drinking normally. Moved the youngest group into the barn shade from noon to 4. No losses, no signs of heat stress beyond the ordinary. 2 miles down the township road, in a confinement barn packed tighter and dependent entirely on mechanical ventilation, and a formulated ration that had, as it turned out, come from one of the affected feedlots named in the state recall notice, Harlan Voss's operation began losing hogs on the 24th. It started, as a handful of animals off their feed, listless in the heat the way any hog might be, and within 4 days it had become something else entirely, a combination the state's later report would describe as heat stress, compounding a low-grade mold toxin exposure that had been sitting undetected in the ration for weeks, weakening the animal's resistance before the heat finished the job. By the end of the month, Harlan Voss had lost 31 hogs, a number that traveled through Cedar County faster than any number involving Levi Esch's small operation ever had. Because 31 dead hogs on the county's most respected operation was the kind of news that did not need embellishing to be remarkable on its own. The feed store counter, which had spent 4 months turning Sour Milk Esch into a punchline, spent the first week of August turning the same story over in its hands and finding it did not fit the old shape anymore. Delbert Snyder, sitting near the stove though the stove was cold in August, out of habit more than need, said to Ray Kessler, "Voss lost 31 head. Did you hear?" And Ray Kessler said, "Heard 34, and Pearl Hutchins, ringing up a sack of feed for a customer who was in no hurry to leave with news like this in the air, said, 'Esch hasn't lost one. Not since spring.' And Delbert said, 'Not one.' And there was a pause in which nobody quite knew what to call that fact out loud, because the nickname they had all been using for months suddenly sounded less like a joke and more like an oversight. Ray Kessler said, "Eventually, well, the sour milks held up better than the recall feed did, and that was as close as the counter came, that week, to admitting the ground had shifted under a story it thought it already knew the ending to." Grace Whitfield drove out a second time in early August, this time with the state recall notice in hand, and a set of questions about Levi's feed sourcing that he answered plainly and completely, showing her the ledger entries for every load of corn he had ground himself that summer, none of it from the affected suppliers, and she left that visit saying she intended to include the contrast in her write-up, not as speculation, but as a documented case, because the state's own investigators would want the comparison for their file regardless of what she published. It was, from the road, a plain thing to see even without a ledger or a state report to explain it. One farm with dead hogs stacked for removal near the barn, and another farm 2 miles up the road where a small crowd of pigs crowded a trough in the shade looking, by any measure a passerby cared to apply, entirely unbothered by the summer they were living through. Harlan Voss came up the Esch Lane on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of August, driving slow, and Levi was at the hog lot when the truck stopped, and he set down the bucket he was carrying and waited without moving toward the fence to meet it halfway. Harlan Voss got out and stood by his truck door a moment before he came any closer, and when he spoke his voice did not carry the way it had carried across the fence line in April. He said, "I was wrong." Levi looked at him for a moment and said, "You were working from what you could see, Harlan. Nobody could see inside a feedlot until it went bad." Harlan Voss nodded once, slowly, and looked past Levi toward the hogs crowding the trough in the shade. Clover among them, first to the rail as she had been every single day since March, and he said, after a silence that went on longer than the apology itself had, "What would it take for me to get some of that whey myself, if the creamery's got more than you're using?" Levi said he would ask Whit Grissom about a second route, and that was the whole of the conversation. No gloating in it on either side, no accounting of the 31 hogs or the 4 months of jokes at the feed store. Just 2 men standing at a fence talking about milk, the way men in that county had always talked about the practical business of keeping animals alive. The apology had run to 4 words. The offer of help that followed it ran to barely 20 more. Between them they closed a distance that had taken all spring and half a summer to open, and neither man made more of the moment than it was, which was in Cedar County, its own kind of respect. Grace Whitfield's write-up appeared in the extension bulletin at the end of August, plain and technical in the way those documents always were. But it carried Levi's feed conversion figures alongside the state-recalled data from Harlan Voss's operation, in a table that made the contrast impossible to misread, even for someone who had no patience for technical language. And within a week 2 other hog operations in the county had called Draymore Creamery, asking about surplus whey of their own. The store counter had, by then, retired the nickname entirely, though Pearl Hutchins let it slip once more out of old habit, and caught herself, saying, "Sour milk. Well, Levi's Hogs," and nobody at the counter corrected her twice, because the correction had already happened in the way that mattered, which was in the tone people used, and not just the words. It was Marcus Doyle who brought the real turn that autumn, a broad, soft-spoken man who ran a smokehouse and specialty butcher operation 2 counties over supplying restaurants, and a handful of grocers who paid well for pork, raised the old way. Heritage breeds and slower diets, and the kind of marbling a formulated ration rarely produced. He had read Grace Whitfield's bulletin the way he read most agricultural notices that crossed his desk, out of habit rather than expectation, and something in the feed conversion numbers and the disease resistance data had stopped him long enough to drive out and see the operation himself. He walked the hog lot with Levi in October, asked pointed questions about the whey sourcing and the finishing weights, and when Levi showed him the ledger, the full 2 years of it, dated entry after dated entry back to that first afternoon in March. Marcus Doyle read several pages in silence before he said, "This is the kind of documentation I ask breeders for, and almost never get." He tasted a sample cut from the first finished group that had gone to slaughter that September, and he said the meat carried a sweetness and a firmness he associated with the old whey-fed hams his own grandfather used to talk about from before refrigeration changed how everyone raised pigs. And he offered Levi a standing contract for as many hogs as he could reliably finish on the program, at a price well above the county's going rate. He also, in the same conversation, suggested Levi could expand considerably if he brought in more whey and more acreage, and hired on additional help, painting a picture of a much larger operation, supplying several of his accounts at once. Levi thanked him and said he would think on it, and what he thought, over the following week, was that Fanny Stoltzfus could manage the daily feeding for perhaps 60 hogs at a stretch without the work becoming a burden rather than a livelihood, and that scaling past what he and Fanny and the whey supply could honestly sustain would trade the thing that made the pork worth Marcus Doyle's premium in the first place, for a volume neither of them could properly tend. He went back to Marcus Doyle with a smaller number than the one offered, 60 hogs a cycle rather than several hundred, and Marcus Doyle, who had built his own business on the difference between a product that was genuinely good and one that merely claimed to be, said that was, if anything, the answer that made him trust the arrangement, more rather than less. The ripple spread through the county quietly after that, the way these things generally do once the initial noise dies down. Harlan Voss began taking a portion of the Creamery's overflow that autumn, feeding it to a section of his own herd separate from the rest as a trial, keeping his own ledger for the first time in 20 years of farming, a fact Ray Kessler mentioned at the store counter with something closer to wonder than gossip. A younger farmer named Peter Glick, who had taken over his father's small operation the previous spring, and had been struggling to make the numbers work against rising feed costs, drove out to the Esch place one October evening and asked Levi plainly how he had known the sour milk would be worth anything when everyone else in the county had spent 11 years treating it as waste. Levi thought about the question longer than its size seemed to require, the way he thought about most things, and then he said what his grandfather had written in a ledger 50 years before he was born, the sentence he had read a dozen times that first winter, and had since carried the way another man might carry a favorite tool. He said, "Nothing is waste, only things without their next job yet." Peter Glick turned that over the way Levi himself had once turned it over at the kitchen table, and did not say much else before he drove home, though he called Draymore Creamery about his own allotment the following week. Levi's son Daniel, 7 years old and given to trailing his father around the hog lot most evenings asking questions the way boys that age tend to, put nearly the same question to him one evening, in early November, while they were carrying feed buckets down toward the trough together, the light going soft and low the way it did that time of year, the whole lot smelling of cut corn stalks, and the particular sourness Levi had long since stopped noticing as anything but ordinary. Daniel said, "How'd you know the sour milk was good, Dad?" when Harlan Voss said it wasn't. Levi set his bucket down and looked out at the hogs a moment before he answered, Clover among them at the rail as always, and he said, everybody called it finished, because they only looked at what it used to be for. I looked at what it still could be for. That's most of it, Daniel. Most everything folks call finished is really just something nobody's checked lately. That winter, on an evening much like the one 2 years before when he had first opened the wooden crate in the harness room, Levi sat again at the kitchen table with his grandfather's ledger and his father's beside it, and his own third ledger, nearly full now, stacked with them. He read the 1938 entry once more, the ink still the color of weak tea, and beneath the last page of his own record, under the final dated entry, noting the season's finishing weights and Marcus Doyle's contract figures, he wrote a line of his own. Plain, unhurried. The same hand that had recorded scours and losses and gains without exaggeration for 2 straight years. He wrote that the sour lot was clear now, the ground recovering under grass planted the previous spring, and that what his grandfather had known about milk was true of most things a person was too quick to call ruined, that the word finished said more about who was looking than about what was actually there. He closed the ledger, set the 3 of them back together on the shelf above the harness room door where anyone who came looking someday would find them stacked in order, and the following morning he went out before full light, the way he did most mornings, to check on Clover and the litter she had farrowed that October, 11 strong, already crowding the trough with the particular unbothered confidence of animals that had never known any other way of being fed. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what's left over isn't worth keeping. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever taken something everyone told you was ruined and found one more use in it before you let it go, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.